Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to miamighostchronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogman, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Stories of the Supernatural, and continuing in the tradition that we started last year for Christmas time ghost stories. This is Spirits of the Season 2024. And our first story is How Fear Departed from the Long Gallery by E.F. Benson. Church Perivale is a house so beset and frequented by specters, both visible and audible, that none of the family which it shelters under its acre and a half of green copper roofs takes psychical phenomena with any seriousness. For to the Perivales, the appearance of a ghost is a matter of hardly greater significance than is the appearance of the post to those who live in more ordinary houses. It arrives, that is to say, practically every day. It knocks, or makes other noises. It is observed coming up the drive or in other places. I myself, when staying there, have seen the present Mrs. Perivale, who is rather short-sighted, peer into the dusk while we were taking our coffee on the terrace after dinner and say to her daughter, "My dear, was not that the blue lady who has just gone into the shrubbery? I hope she won't frighten Flo. Whistle for Flo, dear." Flo, it may be remarked, is the youngest and most precious of many Dotsons. Blanche Perivale gave a cursory whistle and crunched the sugar left unmelted at the bottom of her coffee cup between her very white teeth. "Oh, darling, Flo isn't so silly as to mind," she said. "Poor blue Aunt Barbara is such a bore. Whenever I meet her, she always looks as if she wanted to speak to me. But when I say, 'What is it, Aunt Barbara?' she never utters, but only points somewhere towards the house, which is so vague I believe there was something she wanted to confess about 200 years ago, but she has forgotten what it is." Here Flo gave 2 or 3 short pleased barks, and came out of the shrubbery wagging her tail and capering around what appeared to be a perfectly empty space on the lawn. "There, Flo has made friends with her," said Mrs. Perivale. "I wonder why she in that very stupid shade of blue." From this it may be gathered that even with regard to psychical phenomena, there is some truth in the proverb that speaks of familiarity, but the Perivales do not exactly treat their ghosts with contempt, since most of that delightful family never despised anybody except such people as avowedly did not care for hunting, or shooting, or golf, or skating. And as all of their ghosts are of their family, it seems reasonable to suppose that they all, even the poor blue lady, excelled at one time in field sports. So far then they harbor no such unkindness or contempt, but only pity. Of one Perivale indeed, who broke his neck in vainly attempting to ride up the main staircase on a thoroughbred mare after some monstrous and violent deed in the back garden, they are very fond. And Blanche comes downstairs in the morning with an eye unusually bright when she can announce that Master Anthony was very loud last night. He, apart from the fact of his having been so foul a ruffian, was a tremendous fellow across country, and they like these indications of the continuance of his superb vitality. In fact, it is supposed to be a compliment, when you go to stay at Church Perivale, to be assigned a bedroom which is frequented by defunct members of the family. It means that you are worthy to look on the august and villainous dead. and you will find yourself shown into some vaulted or tapestried chamber, without benefit of electric light, and are told that great-great-grandmamma Bridget occasionally has vague business by the fireplace, but it is better not to talk to her, and that you will hear Master Anthony awfully well if he attempts the front staircase any time before morning. There you are, left for your night's repose, and having quakingly undressed, begin reluctantly to put out your candles. It is draughty in these great chambers, and the solemn tapestry swings and bellows and subsides, and the firelight dances on the forms of huntsmen and warriors in stern pursuits. Then you climb into your bed, a bed so huge that you feel as if the desert of Sahara was spread for you, and pray like the mariners who sailed with St. Paul for a day. And all the time you are aware that Freddie and Harry and Blanche, and possibly even Mrs. Perivale, are quite capable of dressing up and making disquieting tappings outside your door, so that when you open it, some inconjecturable horror fronts you. Myself, I stick steadily to the assertion that I have an obscure vulvular disease of the heart, and so sleep undisturbed in the new wing of the house where Aunt Barbara and great-great-grandmamma Bridget and Master Anthony never penetrate. I forgot the details of great-great-grandmamma Bridget, but she certainly cut the throat of some distant relation before she disemboweled herself with the axe that had been used at Agincourt. Before that, she had led a very sultry life, crammed with amazing incident. But there is one ghost at Church Perivale, at which the family never laugh, in which they feel no friendly and amused interest, and of which they only speak just as much as is necessary for the safety of their guests. More properly, it should be described as two ghosts, for the haunt in question is that of two very young children who were twins. These, not without reason, the family take very seriously indeed. The story of them as told by Mrs. Perivale is as follows. In the year 1602, the same being the last of Queen Elizabeth's reign, a certain Dick Perivale was in great favour at court. He was brother to Master Joseph Perivale, then owner of the family house and lands, who 2 years previously, at the respectable age of 74, became father of twin boys, firstborn of his progeny. It is known that the royal and ancient virgin had said to handsome Dick, who was nearly 40 years his brother's junior, "'Tis pity that you are not master of Church Perivale." And these words probably suggested to him a sinister design. Be that as it may, handsome Dick, who very adequately sustained the family reputation for wickedness, set off to ride down to Yorkshire, and found that very conveniently his brother Joseph had just been seized with an apoplexy, which appeared to be the result of a continued spell of hot weather, combined with the necessity of quenching his thirst with an augmented amount of sack, and had actually died while handsome Dick, with God knows what thoughts in his mind, was journeying northward. Thus it came about that he arrived at Church Perivale just in time for his brother's funeral. It was with great propriety that he attended the obsequies, and turned to spend a sympathetic day or two of mourning with his widowed sister-in-law, who was but a faint-hearted dame, little fit to be mated with such hawks as these. On the second night of his stay, he did that which the Perivales regret to this day. He entered the bedroom where the twins slept with their nurse, and quietly strangled the latter as she slept. Then he took the twins and put them into the fire which warms the long gallery. The weather, which up to the day of Joseph's death had been so hot, had changed suddenly to bitter cold, and the fire was heaped high with burning logs and was exultant with flame. In the core of this conflagration he struck out a cremation chamber, and into that he threw the two children, stamping them down with his riding boots. They could just walk, but they could not walk out of that ardent place. It is said that he laughed as he added more logs. Thus he became master of Church Perivale. The crime was never brought home to him, but he lived no longer than a year in the enjoyment of his blood-stained inheritance. When he lay a-dying, he made his confession to the priest who attended him, but his spirit struggled forth from its fleshly coil before absolution could be given him. On that very night there began in Church Perivale the haunting, which to this day is but seldom spoken of by the family, and then only in low tones and with serious mien. For only an hour or two after handsome Dick's death, one of the servants passing the door of the long gallery heard from within peals of the loud laughter so jovial and yet so sinister, which he had thought would never be heard in the house again. In a moment of that cold courage, which so nearly akin to mortal terror, he opened the door and entered, expecting to see he knew not what manifestation of him who lay dead in the room below. Instead, he saw two little white-robed figures toddling toward him, hand in hand, across the moonlit floor. The watchers in the room below ran upstairs, startled by the crash of his fallen body, and found him lying in the grip of some dread convulsion. Just before morning he regained consciousness and told his tale. Then, pointing with trembling and ash-gray finger toward the door, he screamed aloud and so fell back dead. During the next 50 years, the strange and terrible legend of the twin babies became fixed and consolidated. Their appearance, luckily for those who inhabit the house, was exceedingly rare, and during these years they seem to have been seen 4 or 5 times only. On each occasion they appeared at night, between sunset and sunrise, always in the same long gallery and always as two toddling children, scarcely able to walk, and on each occasion the luckless individual who saw them died either speedily or terribly, or with both speed and terror, after the accursed vision had appeared to him. Sometimes he might live for a few months. He was lucky if he died, as did the servant who first saw them, in a few hours. Vastly more awful was the fate of a certain Mrs. Canning, who had the ill luck to see them in the middle of the next century, or to be quite accurate, in the year 1760. By this time, the hours and the place of their appearance were well known, and up till a year ago, visitors were warned not to go between sunset and sunrise into the long gallery. But Mrs. Canning, a brilliantly clever and beautiful woman, admirer, also and friend of the notorious skeptic Monsieur Voltaire, wilfully went and sat night after night in spite of all protestations in the haunted place. For 4 evenings she saw nothing, but on the 5th she had had her will, for the door in the middle of the gallery opened, and there came toddling towards her the ill-omened, innocent little pair. It seemed that even then she was not frightened, but she thought it good, poor wretch, to mock at them, telling them it was time for them to get back into the fire. They gave no word in answer, but turned away from her crying and sobbing. Immediately after they disappeared from her vision, and she rustled downstairs to where the family and guests in the house were waiting for her, with a triumphant announcement that she had seen them both, and must needs write to Monsieur Voltaire, saying that she had spoken to spirits made manifest. It would make him laugh. But when some months later the whole news reached him, he did not laugh at all. Mrs. Canning was one of the great beauties of her day, and in the year 1760 she was at the height and zenith of her blossoming. The chief beauty, if it is possible to single out one point where all was so exquisite, lay in the dazzling color and incomparable brilliance of her complexion. She was just now 30 years of age, but in spite of the excesses of her life retained the snow and roses of girlhood, and she courted the bright light of day which other women shunned, for it but showed to great advantage the splendor of her skin. In consequence, she was very considerably dismayed one morning, about a fortnight after her strange experience in the long gallery, to observe on her left cheek, an inch or two below her turquoise-colored eyes, a little grayish patch of skin, about as big as a threepenny piece. It was in vain that she applied her accustomed washes and unguents. Vain, too, were the arts of her fardeuse and of her medical adviser. For weeks she slept herself, secluded, martyring herself with solitude and unaccustomed physics, and for result at the end of the week she had no amelioration to comfort herself with. Instead, this woeful grey patch had doubled itself in size. Thereafter, the nameless disease, whatever it was, developed in new and terrible ways. From the center of the discolored place there sprouted forth little lichen-like tendrils of greenish-gray, and another patch appeared on her lower lip. This too soon vegetated, and one morning, on opening her eyes to the horror of a new day, she found that her vision was strangely blurred. She sprang to her looking-glass, and what she saw caused her to shriek aloud with horror. From under her upper eyelid, growth had sprung up mushroom-like in the night, and its filaments extended downward, screening the pupil of her eye. Soon after, her tongue and throat were attacked, the air passages became obstructed, and death by suffocation was merciful after such suffering. More terrible yet was the case of a certain Colonel Blantyre, who fired at the children with his revolver. What he went through is not to be recorded here. It is this haunting, then, that Perivals take quite seriously, and every guest on his arrival in the house is told that the long gallery must not be entered after nightfall, on any pretext whatever. By day, however, it is a delightful room, and intrinsically merits description, apart from the fact that the due understanding of its geography is necessary for the account that here follows. It is full 80 feet in length, and is lit by a row of 6 tall windows looking over the gardens at the back of the house. A door communicates with a landing at the top of the main staircase, and about halfway down the gallery, in the wall facing the windows, is another door, communicating with the back staircase and servants' quarters, and thus the gallery forms a constant place of passage for them in going to the rooms on the first landing. It was through this door that the baby figures came when they appeared to Mrs. Canning, and on several other occasions they have been known to make their entry here, for the room out of which handsome Dick took them lies just beyond, at the top of the back stairs. Further on, again in the gallery, is the fireplace, into which he thrust them, and at the far end a large bow window looks straight down the avenue. Above this fireplace there hangs with grim significance a portrait of handsome Dick, in the insolent beauty of early manhood, attributed to Holbein, and a dozen other portraits of great merit face the windows. During the day this is the most frequented sitting room in the house, for its other visitors never appear there then, nor does it then ever resound with the harsh jovial laugh of handsome Dick, which sometimes after dark has fallen is heard by passers-by on the landing outside. But Blanche does not grow bright-eyed when she hears it. She shuts her ears and hastens to put a greater distance between her and the sound of that atrocious mirth. But during the day the long gallery is frequented by many occupants, and much laughter is nowise sinister or saturnine resounds there. When summer lies hot over the land, those occupants lounge in the deep window seats, and when winter spreads his icy fingers and blows shrilly between his frozen palms, congregate round the fireplace at the far end, and perch in companies of cheerful chatterers upon sofa and chair back and floor. Often have I sat there on long August evenings up till dressing time, but never have I been there when anyone has seemed disposed to linger over late without hearing the warning. It is close on sunset. Shall we go? Later on in the shorter autumn days they often have tea laid there, and sometimes it has happened that, even while merriment was most uproarious, Mrs. Perivale has suddenly looked out of the window and said, "My dears, it is getting so late. Let us finish our nonsense downstairs in the hall." And then for a moment a curious hush always falls on loquacious family and guests alike, and, as if some bad news had just been known, we all make our silent way out of the place. But the spirits of the Perivales, of the living ones, that is to say, are the most mercurial imaginable, and the blight which the thought of handsome Dick and his doings cast over them passes away again with amazing rapidity. A typical party, large, young, and peculiarly cheerful, was staying at Church Perivale shortly after Christmas last year, and as usual on December 31st, Mrs. Perivale was given her annual New Year's Eve ball. The house was quite full, and she had commandeered as well the greater part of the Perivale Arms to provide sleeping quarters for the overflow from the house. For some days past a black and windless frost has stopped all hunting, but it is an ill windlessness that blows no good, if so mixed a metaphor may be forgiven, and the lake below the house had for the last day or two been covered with an adequate and admirable sheet of ice. Everyone in the house had been occupied all the morning of that day in performing swift and violent maneuvers on the elusive surface, and as soon as lunch was over, we all with one exception hurried out again. This one exception was Madge Dalrymple, who had had the misfortune to fall rather badly earlier in the day, but hoped by resting her injured knee, instead of joining the skaters again, to be able to dance that evening. The hope, it was true, was the most sanguine sort, for she could but hobble ignobly back to the house. But with the breezy optimism which characterizes the Perivales, she is Blanche's first cousin, she remarked that it would be but tepid enjoyment that she could in her present state derive from further skating, and thus she sacrificed a little but might gain much. Accordingly, after a rapid cup of coffee, which was served in the long gallery, we left Madge comfortably reclined on the big sofa at right angles to the fireplace, with an attractive book to beguile the tedium-filled tea. Being of the family, she knew all about Handsome Dick and the babies, and the fate of Mrs. Canning and Colonel Blantyre. But as we went out, I heard Blanche say to her, "Don't run it too fine, dear." And Madge had replied, "No, I'll go away well before sunset," and so we left her alone in the long gallery. Madge read her attractive book for some minutes, but failing to get absorbed in it, put it down and limped across the window. Though it was still but little after 2, it was but a dim and uncertain light that entered, for the crystalline brightness of the morning had given place to a veiled obscurity produced by flocks of thick clouds which were coming sluggishly up from the northeast. Already the whole sky was overcast with them, and occasionally a few snowflakes fluttered waveringly down past the long windows. From the darkness and bitter cold of the afternoon, it seemed to her that there was to be a heavy snowfall before long, and these outward signs were echoed inwardly in her by that muffled drowsiness of the brain, which, to those who are sensitive to the pressure and lightness of weather, portends storm. Madge was peculiarly the prey of such external influences. To her, a brisk morning gave ineffable brightness and briskness of spirit, and correspondingly, the approach of heavy weather produced a somnolence and sensation that both drowsed and depressed her. It was in such mood as this that she limped back again to the sofa beside the log fire. The whole house was comfortable and heated by water pipes, and though the fire of logs and peat, an adorable mixture, had been allowed to burn low, the room was very warm. Idly she watched the dwindling flames, not opening her book again, but lying on the sofa with face towards the fireplace, intending drowsily and not immediately to go to her own room and spend the hours until the return of the skaters made gaiety in the house again, in writing 1 or 2 neglected letters. Still drowsily, she began thinking over what she had to do to communicate. One letter, several days overdue, should go to her mother, who was immensely interested in the psychical affairs of the family. She would tell her mother how Master Anthony had been prodigiously active on the staircase a night or 2 ago, and how the Blue Lady, regardless of the severity of the weather, had been seen by Mrs. Perivale that morning strolling about. It was rather interesting. The Blue Lady had gone down the lower walk and had been seen by her to enter the stables, where at the moment Freddie Perivale was inspecting the frost-bound hunters. Identically then, a sudden panic had spread through the stables, and the horses had whinnied and kicked and shied and sweated. Of the fatal twins nothing had been seen for many years past, but as her mother knew, the Perivales never used the long gallery after dark. Then for a moment she sat up, remembering that she was in the long gallery now. But it was still but a little 2:30, and if she went to her room in half an hour, she would have ample time to write this and another letter before tea. Till then, she would read her book, but she found she had left it on the window-sill, and it seemed scarcely worthwhile to get it. She felt exceedingly drowsy. The sofa where she lay had been lately recovered in a grayish-green shade of velvet, somewhat the color of lichen. It was very thick, soft texture, and she luxuriously stretched her arms out, one on each side of her body, and pressed her fingers into the nap. How horrible that story of Mrs. Canning was! The growth on her face was of the color of lichen, and then without further transition or blurring of thought, Madge fell asleep. She dreamed. She dreamed that she awoke and found herself exactly where she had gone to sleep, and exactly the same attitude. The flames from the logs had burned up again, and leaped on the walls, fitfully illuminating the picture of Handsome Dick above the fireplace. In her dream she knew exactly what she had done today, and for what reason she was lying there now, instead of being out with the rest of the skaters. She remembered, also still dreaming, that she was going to write a letter or 2 before tea, and prepared to get up in order to go to her room. As she half rose, she caught sight of her own arms lying out on each side of her on the grey velvet sofa. But she could not see where her hands ended, and where the grey velvet began. Her fingers seemed to have melted into the stuff. She could see her wrist quite clearly, and a blue vein on the back of her hands, and here and there a knuckle. Then in her dream she remembered the last thought which had been in her mind before she fell asleep, namely the growth of the lichen-colored vegetation on the face and the eyes and the throat of Mrs. Canning. At that thought, the strangling terror of real nightmare began. She knew that she was being transformed into this gray stuff, and she was absolutely unable to move. Soon the gray would spread up her arms and over her feet. When they came in from skating, they would find here nothing but a huge misshapen cushion of lichen-colored velvet, and that would be she. The horror grew more acute, and then by violent effort she shook herself free of the clutches of this very evil dream, and she awoke. For a minute or two she lay there conscious only of the tremendous relief of finding herself awake. She felt again with her fingers the pleasant touch of the velvet, and drew them backwards and forwards, assuring herself that she was not, as her dream had suggested, melting into grayness and softness. But she was still, in spite of the violence of her awakening, very sleepy, and lay there till looking down she was aware that she could not see her hands at all. It was very nearly dark. At that moment a sudden flicker of flame came from the dying fire, and a flare of burning gas from the peat flooded the room. The portrait of handsome Dick looked evilly down on her, and her hands were visible again. And then a panic worse than the panic of her dream seized her. Daylight had altogether faded, and she knew that she was there alone in the dark in the terrible gallery. The panic was of the nature of nightmare, for she felt unable to move for terror, but it was worse than nightmare because she knew she was awake. And then the full cause of this frozen fear dawned on her. She knew the certainty of absolute conviction that she was about to see the twin babies. She felt a sudden moisture break out on her face, and within her mouth her tongue and throat were suddenly dry, and she felt all tongue grate along the inner surface of her teeth. All power of movement had slipped from her limbs, leaving them dead and inert, and she stared with wide eyes into the blackness. The spurt of flame from the peat had burned itself out again, and darkness encompassed her. Then on the wall opposite her, facing the windows, there grew a faint light of dusky crimson. For a moment she thought it but heralded the approach of the awful vision. Then hope revived in her heart, and she remembered that thick clouds had overcast the sky before she went to sleep, and guessed that this light came from the sun not yet quite sunk and set. This sudden revival of hope gave her the necessary stimulus, and she sprang off the sofa where she lay. She looked out of the window and saw the dull glow on the horizon, but before she could take a step forward, it was obscured again. A tiny sparkle of light came from the hearth, which did no more than illuminate the tiles of the fireplace, and snow falling heavily tapped at the window panes. There was neither light nor sound except these. But the courage that had come to her, giving her the power of movement, had not quite deserted her. She began feeling her way down the gallery, and then she found that she was lost. She stumbled against a chair, and recovering herself, stumbled against another. Then a table barred her way, and turning swiftly aside, she found herself up against the back of a sofa. Once more she turned and saw the dim gleam of the firelight on the opposite side to that on which she expected it. In her blind groping she must have reversed her direction. But which way was she to go now? She seemed blocked in by furniture, and all the time, insistent and imminent, was the fact that the two innocent, terrible ghosts were about to appear to her. Then she began to pray. "Lighten our darkness, O Lord," she said to herself. She could not remember how the prayer continued, and she had sore need of it. It was something about the perils of the night. All this time she felt about her with groping, fluttering hands. The fire glimmer, which should have been on her left, was on her right again. Therefore she must turn herself around. "Lighten our darkness," she whispered, and then aloud she repeated, "Lighten our darkness." She stumbled up against a screen, and could not remember the existence of any such screen. Hastily she felt beside it with blind hands, and touched something soft and velvety. Was it the sofa on which she had lain? If so, where was the head of it? It had a head, and a back and feet. It was like a person, all covered with grey lichen. Then she lost her head completely. All that remained to her was to pray. She was lost, lost in this awful place where no one came in the dark except the babies that cried. And she heard her voice rising from whisper to speech, and speech to scream. She shrieked out the holy words, she yelled them as if blaspheming, as she groped among the tables and chairs and the pleasant things of ordinary life which had become so terrible. Then came a sudden and awful answer to her screamed prayer. Once more a pocket of inflammable gas in the peat on the hearth was reached by the smoldering embers, and the room started into light. She saw the evil eyes of handsome Dick. She saw the little ghostly snowflakes falling thickly outside. And she saw where she was, just opposite the door through which the terrible twins made their entrance. Then the flame went out again and left her in blackness once more. But she had gained something, for she had her geography now. The center of the room was bare of furniture, and one swift dart would take her to the door of the landing, above the main staircase, and into safety. In that gleam she had been able to see the handle of the door, bright brass, luminous like a star. She would go straight for it. It was but a matter of a few seconds now. She took a long breath, partly of relief, partly to satisfy the demands of her galloping heart. But the breath was only half taken when she was stricken once more into the immobility of nightmare. There came a little whisper, it was no more than that, from the door opposite which she stood, and through which the twin babies entered. It was not quite dark outside, for she could see that the door was opening, and there stood in the opening two little white figures side by side. They came towards her slowly, shufflingly. She could not see face or form at all distinctly, but the two little white figures were advancing. She knew them to be the ghosts of terror, innocent of the awful doom they were bound to bring, even as she was innocent. With the inconceivable rapidity of thought, she made up her mind what to do. She had not hurt them or laughed at them, and they were but babies when the wicked and the bloody deed had sent them to their burning death. Surely the spirits of these children would not be inaccessible to the cry of one who was of the same blood as they, who had committed no fault that merited the doom they brought. If she entreated them, they might have mercy. They might forbear to bring the curse on her. They might allow her to pass out of the place without blight, without the sentence of death or the shadow of things worse than death upon her. It was but for the space of a moment that she hesitated. Then she sank down onto her knees and stretched out her hands towards them. "Oh, my dear," she said, "I only fell asleep. I've done no more wrongful than that." She paused a moment, and her tender girl's heart thought no more of herself, but only of them, those little innocent spirits on whom so awful a doom was laid, that they should bring death where other children bring laughter, and doom for delight. But all those who had seen them before had dreaded and feared them, or had mocked at them. Then, as the enlightenment of pity dawned on her, her fear fell from her like the wrinkled sheath that holds the sweet folded buds of spring. "Dears, I am so sorry for you," she said. "It is not your fault that you must bring me what you must bring, but I am not afraid any longer. I am only sorry for you. God bless you, you poor darlings." She raised her head and looked at them. Though it was so dark, she could now see their faces, though all was dim and wavering, like the light of pale flames shaken by a draught. But the faces were not miserable or fierce. They smiled at her with shy little baby smiles, and as she looked, they grew faint, fading slowly away like wreaths of vapor in frosty air. Madge did not at once move when they had vanished, for instead of fear there were wrapped around her a wonderful sense of peace, so happy and serene that she could not willingly stir, and so perhaps disturb it. But before long she got up, and feeling her way, but without any sense of nightmare pressing her on, or frenzy of fear to spur her, she went out of the long gallery to find Blanche just coming upstairs whistling and swinging her skates. "How's the leg, dear?" she asked. "You're not limping any more." Till that moment Madge had not thought of it. "I think it must be all right," she said. "I'd forgotten it. Anyhow, Blanche, dear, won't you be frightened for me? Will you? But I have seen the twins." For a moment Blanche's face whitened with terror. "What?" she was said in a whisper. "Yes, I saw them just now, but they were kind. They smiled at me, and I was sorry for them, and somehow I am sure I have nothing to fear." It seems that Madge was right, for nothing has come to touch her. Something, her attitude to them, we must suppose, her pity, her sympathy, touched and dissolved and annihilated the curse. Indeed, I was at Church Perivale only last week, arriving there after dark. Just as I passed the gallery door, Blanche came out. "Ah, there you are," she said. "I've just been seeing the twins. They look too sweet," and stopped nearly 10 minutes. "Let us have tea at once." The Crown Derby Plate by Marjorie Bowen. Martha Plym it said that she had never seen a ghost, and that she would very much like to do so, particularly at Christmas, where you can laugh as you like. That is the correct time to see a ghost. I don't suppose you ever will, replied her cousin Mabel, comfortably, while her cousin Clara shuddered, and said that she hoped they would change the subject, for he disliked even to think of such things. The three elderly, cheerful women sat round a big fire, cozy and content after a day of pleasant activities. Martha was the guest of the other two, who owned the handsome, convenient country house. She always came to spend her Christmas with the Wintons, and found the leisurely country life delightful after the bustling rounds of London. For Martha managed an antique shop of the better sort, and worked extremely hard. She was, however, still full of zest for work or pleasure, though 60 years old, and looked backwards and forwards for a succession of delightful days. The other two, Mabel and Clara, led quieter but none the less agreeable lives. They had more money and fewer interests, but nevertheless enjoyed themselves very well. Talking of ghosts, said Mabel, I wonder how that old woman at Hartley's is getting on, for Hartley's, you know, is supposed to be haunted. Yes, I know, smiled Miss Pym, but all the years that we have known of the place, we have never heard anything definite, have we? No, put in Clara, but there is that persistent rumor that the house is uncanny, and for myself, nothing would induce me to live there. It is certainly very lonely and dreary down there on the marshes, conceded Mabel. But as for the ghost, you never hear what it is supposed to be even. Who has taken it? Asked Miss Pym, remembering Hartley's as very desolate indeed, and long shut up. A Miss Lefane, an eccentric old creature. I think you met her here once, 2 years ago? I believe that I did, but I don't recall her at all. We have not seen her since. Hartley's is so ungettable, and she didn't seem to want visitors. She collects china, Martha, so really you ought to go and see her and talk shop. With the word china, some curious associations came into the mind of Martha Pym. She was silent while she strove to put them together, and after a second or two they all fitted together into a very clear picture. She remembered that 30 years ago, yes, it must be 30 years ago, when as a young woman she had put all her capital into the antique business, and had been staying with her cousins, her aunt had then been alive, that she had driven across the marsh to Hartley's, where there was an auction sale. All the details of this she had completely forgotten, but she could recall quite clearly purchasing a set of gorgeous china, which was still one of her proud delights, a perfect set of Crown Derby, save that one plate was missing. How odd, she remarked, that this Miss Lefane should collect china too, for it was at Hartley's that I purchased my dear old Derby service. I've never been able to match that plate. A plate was missing? I seem to remember, said Clara. Didn't they say that it must be in the house somewhere, and that it should be looked for? I believe they did, but of course I never heard any more, and that missing plate has annoyed me ever since. Who had Hartley's? An old connoisseur, Sir James Sewell. I believe he was some relation to this Miss Lefane, but I don't know. I wonder if she has found the plate, mused Miss Pym. I expect she has turned out and ransacked the whole place. Why not trot over and ask, suggested Mabel. It is not much use to her if she has found it, one odd plate. Don't be silly, said Clara. Fancy going over the marshes this weather to ask about a plate missed all those years ago. I'm sure Martha wouldn't think of it. But Martha did think of it. She was rather fascinated by the idea. How queer and pleasant it would be if after all these years, nearly a lifetime, she should find the Crown Derby plate, the loss of which had always irked her. And this hope did not seem so altogether fantastical. It was quite likely that old Miss Lefane, poking about in the ancient house, had found the missing piece. And of course, if she had, being a fellow collector, she would be willing to part with it to complete the set. Her cousin endeavored to dissuade her. Miss Lefane, she declared, was a recluse, an odd creature, who might greatly resent such a visit and such a request. Well, if she does, I can but come away again, smiled Miss Pym. I suppose she can't buy my head off, and I'd rather like meeting these curious types. We've got a love for old china in common, anyhow. It seems so silly to think of it. After all these years, a plate. A Crown Derby plate, corrected Miss Pym. It is certainly strange that I didn't think of it before, but now that I've got it into my head, I can't get it out. Besides, she said hopefully, I might see the ghost. So full, however, were the days with pleasant local engagements that Miss Pym had no immediate chance of putting her scheme into practice. But she did not relinquish it, and she asked several different people what they knew about Hartley's and Miss Lefane. And no one knew anything, save that the house was supposed to be haunted and the owner cracky. Is there a story, asked Miss Pym, who associated ghosts with neat tales into which they fitted as exactly as nuts into shells? But she was always told, oh no, there isn't a story. No one knows anything else about the place. Don't know how the idea got about. Old Sewell was half crazy. I believe he was buried in the garden, and that gave a house a nasty name. Very unpleasant, said Martha Pym, undisturbed. This ghost seemed too elusive for her to track down. She would have to be content if she could recover the Crown Derby plate. For that at least she was determined to make a try, and also to satisfy that faint tingling of curiosity roused in her by this talk about Hartley's and the remembrance of that day so long ago when she had gone to the auction sale at the lonely old house. So the first free afternoon, while Mabel and Clara were comfortably taking their afternoon repose, Martha Pym, who was of a more lively habit, got out her little governess cart and dashed away across the Essex flats. She had taken minute directions with her, but she soon lost her way. Under the wintry sky, which looked as gray and hard as metal, the marshes stretched bleakly to the horizon. The olive-brown broken reeds were harsh as scars on the saffron-tinted bogs, where the sluggish waters that rose so high in winter were filmed over with the first stillness of a frost. The air was cold but not keen. Everything was damp. Faintest of mist blurred the black outlines of trees that rose stark from the ridges above the stagnant dikes. The flooded fields were haunted by blackbirds and whitebirds, gulls and crows, winding above the long ditch grass and wintry wastes. Miss Pym stopped the little horse and surveyed this spectral scene, which had a certain relish about it, to one sure to return to a homely village, a cheerful house, and good company. A withered and bleached old man, in color like the dun landscape, came along the road between the sparse elders. Miss Pym, buttoning up her coat, asked the way to Hartley. As he passed her, he told her straight on, and she proceeded, straight indeed across the road that went with undeviating length across the marshes. Of course, thought Miss Pym, if you live in a place like this, you are bound to invent ghosts. The house sprang up suddenly on a knoll ringed with rotting trees, encompassed by an old brick wall that the perpetual damp had overrun with lichen, blue, green, white colors of decay. Hartley's, no doubt. There was no other residence of human being in sight in all the wide expanse. Besides, she could remember it surely after all this time, the sharp rising out of the marsh, the colony of tall trees, and then fields and trees had been green and bright. There had been no water on the flats. It had been summertime. She certainly, thought Miss Pym, must be crazy to live here, and I'd rather doubt if I shall get my plate. She fastened up the good little horse by the garden gate, which stood negligently ajar, and entered. The garden itself was so neglected it was quite surprising to see a trim appearance in the house. Curtains at the window and a polish on the brass door knocker, which must have been recently rubbed there, considering the taint in the sea of damp which rusted and rotted everything. It was a square-built, substantial house with nothing wrong with it but the situation. Miss Pym decided that was not very attractive, being built of that drab plastered stone so popular 100 years ago, with flat windows and door, while one side was gloomily shaded by a large evergreen tree of the cypress variety, which gave a blackish tinge to that portion of the garden. There was no pretense at flower beds, nor any manner of cultivation. In this garden were a few rank weeds and straggling bushes matted together above the dead grass on the enclosing wall, which appeared to have been built high as protection against the ceaseless winds that swung along the flats, were the remains of the fruit trees, their crucified branches rotting under the great nails that held them up, looked like the skeletons of those who had died in torment. Miss Pym took in these noxious details as she knocked firmly at the door. They did not depress her. She merely felt extremely sorry for anyone who could live in such a place. She noticed at the far end of the garden, in the corner of the wall, a headstone showing above the sodden, colorless grass, and remembered what she had been told about the old antiquary being buried there in the grounds of Hartley's. As the knock had no effect, she stepped back and looked at the house. It was certainly inhabited, with those neat windows, white curtains, and drab blinds, all pulled to precisely the same level. And when she brought her glance back to the door, she saw that it had been opened, and that someone, considerably obscured by the darkness of the passage, was looking at her intently. "Good afternoon," said Miss Pym cheerfully. "I just thought that I would call to see Miss Lefane. It is Miss Lefane, isn't it?" "It's my house," was a querulous reply. Martha Pym had hardly expected to find any servants here, though the old lady must, she thought, work pretty hard to keep the house so clean and tidy as it appeared to be. "Of course," she replied. "May I come in? I'm Martha Pym, staying with the Wintons. I met you there." "Do come in," was the faint reply. "I get so few people to visit me. I'm really very lonely." "I don't wonder," thought Miss Pym, but she had resolved to take no notice of any eccentricity on the part of her hostess, and so she entered the house with her usual agreeable candor and courtesy. The passage was badly lit, but she was able to get a fair idea of Miss Lefane. Her first impression was that this poor creature was most dreadfully old, older than any human being had the right to be. Why, she felt young in comparison. So faded, feeble, and pallid was Miss Lefane. She was also monstrously fat. Her gross, flaccid figure was shapeless, and she wore a badly cut full dress of no color at all, but stained with earth and damp, where Miss Pym supposed she had been doing futile gardening. This gown was doubtless designed to disguise her stoutness, but had been so carelessly pulled about that it only added to it, being rucked and rolled all over the place, as Miss Pym put it to herself. Another ridiculous touch about the appearance of the poor old lady was her short hair. Decrepit as she was, and lonely as she lived, she had actually had her scanty relics of white hair cropped around her shaking head. "Dear me, dear," she said in her thin, treble voice. "How very kind of you to come. I suppose you prefer the parlor. I generally sit in the garden." "The garden? But not in this weather." "I get used to the weather. You've no idea how used one gets to the weather." "I suppose so," conceded Miss Pym doubtfully. "You don't live here quite alone, do you?" "Quite alone lately. I had a little company, but she was taken away. I'm sure I don't know where. I haven't been able to find a trace of her anywhere," replied the old lady peevishly. "Some wretched companion that couldn't stick it, I suppose," thought Miss Pym. "Well, I don't wonder. But someone ought to be here to look after her." They went into the parlor, which the visitor was dismayed to see was without a fire, but otherwise well kept. And there on dozens of shelves was a choice array of china at which Martha Pym's eyes glistened. "Aha!" cried Miss Lefane, "I see you've noticed my treasures. Don't you envy me? Don't you wish that you had some of those pieces?" Martha Pym certainly did, and she looked eagerly and greedily round the walls, tables, and cabinets, while the old woman followed her with little thin squeals of pleasure. It was a beautiful little collection, most choicely and elegantly arranged, and Martha Pym thought it marvelous that this feeble ancient creature should be able to keep it in such precise order as well as doing her own housework. "Do you really do everything yourself here, and live quite alone?" she asked, and she shivered even in her thick coat, and wished that Miss Lefane's energy had risen to a fire, but then probably she lived in the kitchen, as these lonely eccentrics often did. "There was someone," answered Miss Lefane cunningly, "but I had to send her away. I told you, she's gone. I can't find her. And I'm so glad, of course," she added wistfully. "It leaves me very lonely. But then, I couldn't stand her impertinence any longer. She used to say that it was her house, and her collection of china. Would you believe it? She used to try to chase me away from looking at my own things." "How very disagreeable," said Miss Pym, wondering which of the two women had been crazy. "But hadn't you better get someone else?" "Oh, no," was the jealous answer. "I would rather be alone with my things. I daren't leave the house, for fear someone takes them away. There was a dreadful time once when an auction sale was held here." "Were you here then?" asked Miss Pym. But indeed she looked old enough to have been anywhere. "Yes, of course," Miss Lefane replied rather peevishly. And Miss Pym, of course, decided she must be a relation of old Sir James Sewell. Clara and Mabel had been very foggy about it all. I was very busy hiding all the china. The one they got, a Crown Derby tea service. With one plate missing, cried Martha Pym. I bought it. And do you know I was wondering if you'd found it? I hid it, piped Miss Lefane. Oh, you did you? Well, that's rather funny behavior. Why did you hide the stuff away instead of buying it? How could I buy what was mine? Well, Sir James left it to you then, asked Martha Pym, feeling very muddled. She bought a lot more, squeaked Miss Lefane, but Martha Pym tried to keep her to the point. If you've got the plate, she insisted, you might let me have it. I'll pay quite handsomely. It would be so pleasant to have it after all these years. Money is no use to me, said Miss Lefane mournfully. Not a bit of use. I can't leave the house or the garden. Well, you have to live, I suppose, replied Martha Pym cheerfully. And do you know, I'm afraid you're getting rather morbid and dull, living here all alone. You really ought to have a fire. Why, it's just on Christmas and very damp. I have felt the cold for a long time, replied the other. She seated herself with a sigh on one of the horsehair chairs, and Miss Pym noticed with a start that her feet were covered only by a pair of white stockings. One of those nasty health fiends, thought Miss Pym, but she doesn't look too well for all that. So you don't think that you could let me have the plate? She asked briskly, walking up and down, for the dark, neat, clean parlor was very cold indeed, and she thought that she couldn't stand this much longer, as there seemed to be no sign of tea or anything pleasant and comfortable, and she had really better go. I might let you have it, sighed Miss Lefane, since you've been so kind as to pay me a visit. After all, one plate isn't much use, is it? Of course not. I wondered you troubled to hide it. I couldn't bear, wailed the other, to see the things going out of the house. Martha Pym couldn't stop to go into all of this. It was quite clear the old lady was very eccentric indeed, and that nothing very much could be done with her. No wonder that she had dropped out of everything, and no one ever saw her or knew anything about her, though Miss Pym felt that some effort ought really to be made to save her from herself. Wouldn't you like a run in my own little governess cart, she suggested. We might go to tea with the Wintons on the way back. They'd be delighted to see you, and I really think that you do want taking out of yourself. I was taken out of myself some time ago, replied Miss Lefane. I really was, and I couldn't leave my things. Though, she added, with pathetic gratitude, it is very, very kind of you. Your things would be quite safe, I'm sure, said Martha Pym, humoring her. Who would ever come up here this hour of a winter's day? They do. Oh, they do. And she might come back, prying and nosing, and saying that it was all hers, all my beautiful china, hers. Miss Lefane squealed in her agitation, and rising up, ran around the walls, fingering with flaccid yellow hands the brilliant, glossy pieces on the shelves. Well then, I'm afraid that I must go. They'll be expecting me, and it's quite a long ride. Perhaps some other time you'll come and see us? Oh, must you go? Quavered Miss Lefane dolefully. I do like a little company now and then, and I trusted you from the first. The others, when they do come, are always after my things, and I have to frighten them away. Frighten them away? Replied Martha Pym. However do you do that? It doesn't seem difficult. People are so easily frightened, aren't they? Miss Pym suddenly remembered that Hartley's had the reputation of being haunted. Perhaps the queer old thing played on that. The lonely house with a grave in the garden was dreary enough around which to create a legend. I suppose you've never seen a ghost? She asked pleasantly. I'd rather like to see one, you know. There is no one here but myself, said Miss Lefane. So, you've never seen anything? I thought it must all be nonsense. Still, I do think it rather melancholy for you to live here all alone. Miss Lefane sighed. Yes, it's very lonely. Do stay and talk to me a little longer. Her whistling voice dropped cunningly. And I'll give you the Crown Derby plate. Are you sure you've really got it? Miss Pym asked. I'll show you. Fat and waddling as she was, she seemed to move very lightly as she slipped in front of Miss Pym and conducted her from the room, going down, up the stairs, Such a gross, odd figure in that clumsy dress with a fringe of white hair hanging onto her shoulders. The upstairs of the house was as neat as the parlor, everything well in its place, but there was no sign of occupancy. The beds were covered with dust sheets. There were no lamps or fire sets ready. I suppose, said Miss Pym to herself, she doesn't care to show me where she really lives. But as they passed from one room to another, she could not help saying, Where do you live, Miss Lefane? Mostly in the garden, said the other. Miss Pym thought of those horrible health nuts that some people indulged in. Well, sooner you than I, she repeated cheerfully. In the most distant room of all, a dark, tiny closet, Miss Lefane opened a deep cupboard and brought out a Crown Derby plate, which her guest received with a spasm of joy, for it was actually that missing from her cherished set. It's very good of you, she said in delight. Won't you take something for it, or let me do something for you? You might come and see me again, replied Miss Lefane wistfully. Oh, yes, of course. I should like to come and see you again. But now that she had got what she had come for, the plate, Martha Pym wanted to be gone. It was really very dismal and depressing in the house, and she began to notice a fearful smell. The place had been shut up too long. There was something damp rotting somewhere in this horrid little dark closet, no doubt. I really must be going, she said hurriedly. Miss Lefane turned as if to cling to her, but Martha Pym moved quickly away. Dear me, wailed the old lady. Why are you in such haste? There's a smell, murmured Miss Pym rather faintly. She found herself hastening down the stairs with Miss Lefane complaining behind her. How peculiar people are. She used to talk of a smell. Well, you must notice it yourself. Miss Pym was in the hall. The old woman had not followed her, but stood in the semi-darkness at the head of the stairs, a pale, shapeless figure. Martha Pym hated to be rude and ungrateful, but she could not stay another moment. She hurried away and was in her cart in a moment. Really, that smell. Goodbye, she called out with false cheerfulness, and thank you so much. There was no answer from the house. Miss Pym drove on. She was rather upset, and took another way than that by which she had come, a way that led past a little house raised above the marsh. She was glad to think that the poor old creature at Hartley's had such near neighbors, and she reined up the horse, dubious as to whether she should call someone and tell them that poor old Miss Lefane really wanted a little looking after, alone in a house like that, and plainly not quite right in her head. A young woman, attracted by the sound of the governess cart, came to the door of the house, and seeing Miss Pym, called out, asking if she wanted the keys to the house. What house? Asked Miss Pym. Hartley's, Mum. They done put a board out, as no one is likely to pass, but is to be sold. Miss Lefane wants to sell or let it. I've just been up to see her. Oh, no, Mum. She's been away a year, abroad somewhere. Couldn't stand the place. It's been empty since then. I just run in every day and keep things tidy. Loquacious and curious, the young woman had come to the fence. Miss Pym had stopped her horse. Miss Lefane is there now, she said. She must have just come back. She wasn't there this morning, Mum. 'Tisn't likely she'd come either. Fair scared she was, Mum. Fair chased away. Didn't dare move her china. Can't say I've noticed anything myself, but I never stay long, and there's a smell. Yes, murmured Martha Pym faintly, there's a smell. What chased her away? The young woman, even in that lonely place, lowered her voice. Well, as you aren't thinking of taking the place, she got an idea in her head that old Sir James, well, he couldn't bear to leave Hartley's, Mum. He's buried in the garden, and she thought he was after her, chasing round them bits of china. Oh, cried Miss Pym. Some of it used to be his. She found a lot stuffed away. He said there were to be left in Hartley, but Miss Lefane would have the thing sold, I believe. That's years ago. Yes, said Miss Pym, with a sick look. You don't know what he was like, do you? No, Mum, but I've heard he was very stout and very old. I wonder who it was you saw up at Hartley's. Miss Pym took a Crown Derby plate from her bag. You might take that back when you go, she whispered. I shan't want it after all. Before the astonished young woman could answer, Miss Pym had darted off across the marsh, the short hair, that earth-stained robe. the white socks. I generally live in the garden. Miss Pym drove away breakneck speed, frantically resolving to mention to no one that she had paid a visit to Hartley's, nor likely again to bring up the subject of ghosts. She shook and shuddered in the damp, trying to get out of her clothes and her nostrils that indescribable smell. Christmas Meeting by Rosemary Timperley. I have never spent Christmas alone before. It gives me an uncanny feeling sitting alone in my furnished room with my head full of ghosts and the room full of voices of the past. It's a drowning feeling, all the Christmases of the past coming back in a mad jumble. The childish Christmas with a house full of relations, a tree in the window, sixpences in the pudding, and a delicious crinkly stocking in the dark morning. The adolescent Christmas with mother and father, the war, and the bitter cold, and the letters from abroad. The first really grown-up Christmas with a lover, the snow and the enchantment, red wine and kisses, and the walk in the dark before midnight, with the ground so white and the stars diamond bright in a black sky. So many Christmases through the years. And now, the first Christmas alone, but not quite loneliness, a feeling of companionship with all the other people who are spending Christmas alone, millions of them, past and present. A feeling that if I close my eyes there will be no past or future, only an endless present which is time, because it is all we ever have. Yes, however cynical you are, however religious, it makes you feel queer to be alone at Christmas time. So I'm absurdly relieved when the young man walks in. There's nothing romantic about it. I'm a woman of nearly 50, a spinster schoolmarm with grim dark hair and myopic eyes that once were beautiful, and he's a kid of 20, rather unconventionally dressed, with a flowing white-colored tie and black velvet jacket, and brown curls, which could do with a taste of the barber's scissors. The effeminacy of his dress is belied by his features. Narrow, piercing, blue eyes, an arrogant jutting nose and chin. Not that he looks strong. The skin is fine drawn over the prominent feature, and he is very white. He bursts in without knocking, then pauses, says, "I'm so sorry. I thought this was my room." He begins to go out, then hesitates and says, "Are you alone?" "Yes." "It's queer being alone at Christmas, isn't it? May I stay and talk?" "I'd be glad if you would." He comes right in and sits down by the fire. "I hope you don't think I came in here on purpose. I really did think it was my room," he explains. "I'm glad you made the mistake. But you're a very young person to be alone at Christmas time. I wouldn't go back to the country to my family. It would hold up my work. I'm a writer." "I see." I can't help smiling a little. That explains his rather unusual dress. And he takes himself so seriously, this young man. "Of course, you mustn't waste a precious moment of writing," I say with a twinkle. "No, not a moment. That's what my family won't see. They don't appreciate urgency. Families are never appreciative of the artistic nature." "No, they aren't," he agrees seriously. "What are you writing?" "Poetry and a diary combined. It's called My Poems and I by Frances Randall. That's my name. My family says there's no point in my writing, that I'm too young. But I don't feel young. Sometimes I feel like an old man, with too much to do before he dies. Revolving faster and faster on the wheel of creativeness. Yes, yes, exactly. You understand. You must read my work sometime. Please read my work. Read my work." A note of desperation in his voice, a look of fear in his eyes, makes me say, "We're both getting much too solemn for Christmas Day. I'm going to make you some coffee, and I have a plum cake." I move about, clattering cups, spooning coffee into my percolator, but I must have offended him, for when I look around, I find he has left me. I am absurdly disappointed. I finish making coffee, however, then turn to the bookshelf in the room. It is piled high with volumes, for which the landlady has apologized profusely. "Hope you don't mind the books, miss, but my husband won't part with them. And there's nowhere else to put them. We charge a bit less for the room for that reason." "I don't mind," I said. "Books are good friends." But these aren't very friendly-looking books. I take one at random. Or does some strange fate guide my hand? Sipping my coffee and inhaling my cigarette smoke, I begin to read the battered little book. Published, I see, in spring 1852. It's mainly poetry, immature stuff, but vivid. But there's a kind of diary, more realistic, less affected. Out of curiosity to see if there are any amusing comparisons, I turn to the entry for Christmas Day, 1851. I read, "My first Christmas Day alone. I had rather an odd experience. When I went back to my lodgings after a walk, there was a middle-aged woman in my room. I thought at first I'd walked into the wrong room, but this was not so, and later, after a pleasant talk, she disappeared. I suppose she was a ghost, but I wasn't frightened. I liked her, but I do not feel well tonight. Not well at all. I have never felt ill at Christmas before." A publisher's note followed the last entry. Francis Randall died from a sudden heart attack on the night of Christmas Day, 1851. The woman mentioned in his final entry in his diary was the last person to see him alive, in spite of requests for her to come forward. She never did so. Her identity remains a mystery. Transition by Algernon Blackwood. John Mudberry was on his way home from the shops, his arms full of Christmas presents. It was after 6 o'clock and the streets were very crowded. He was an ordinary man, lived in an ordinary suburban flat, with an ordinary wife and ordinary children. He did not think them ordinary, but everybody else did. He had ordinary presents for each one, a cheap blotter for his wife, a cheap air gun for the boy, and so forth. He was over 50, bald, in an office, decent in mind and habits, of uncertain opinions, uncertain politics, and uncertain religion. Yet he considered himself a decided, positive gentleman, quite unaware that the morning newspaper determined his opinions for the day. He just lived, from day to day. Physically he was fit enough, except for a weak heart which never troubled him, and his summer holidays was bad golf, while the children bathed and his wife read Gavras on the sands. Like the majority of men, he dreamed idly of the past, muddled away the present, and guessed vaguely, after imaginative reading on occasions, at the future. "I'd like to survive all right," he said, "provided it's better than this," surveying his wife and children, and thinking of his daily toil, otherwise. And he shrugged his shoulders as a brave man should. He went to church regularly, but nothing in church convinced him that he did survive, just as nothing in church enticed him into hoping that he would. On the other hand, nothing in life persuaded him that he didn't, wouldn't, couldn't. "I'm an evolutionist," he'd love to say to thoughtful cronies over a glass, having never heard that Darwinism had been questioned. And so he came home gaily, happily, with his bunch of Christmas presents for the wife and little ones, stroking himself upon their keen enjoyment and excitement. The night before, he had taken the wife to see Magic at a select London theatre, where the intellectuals went, and had been extraordinarily stirred. He had gone questioningly, yet expecting something out of the common. "It's not musical," he warned her, "nor farce, nor comedy, so to speak," and in answer to her question as to what the critics had said, he had wiggled, sighed, and put his gaudy necktie straight 4 times in quick succession. For no man in the street with any claim to self-respect could be expected to understand what the critics had said, even if he understood the play. And John had answered truthfully, "Oh, they just said things, but the theater's always full, and that's the only test." And just now, as he crossed the crowded circus to catch his bus, it chanced that his mind, having glimpsed an advertisement, was full of this particular play, or rather the effect it had produced upon him at the time, for it had thrilled him. Inexplicably, with its marvelous speculative hint, its big audacity, its alert and spiritual beauty, thought plunged to find something, plunged after this bizarre suggestion of a bigger universe, after this quasi-jocular suggestion that man is not the only, then dashed full tilt against a sentence that memory thrust beneath his nose. Science does not exhaust the universe, and at the same time dashed full tilt against destruction of another kind as well. How it happened, he never exactly knew. He saw a monster glaring at him with eyes of blazing fire. It was horrible. It rushed upon him. He dodged. Another monster met him round the corner. Both came at him simultaneously. He dodged again. A leap that might have cleared a hurdle easily, but was too late. Between the pair of them, his heart literally in his gullet, he was mercilessly caught. Bones crunched. There was a soft sensation, icy cold and hot as fire. Horns and voices roared. Battering rams he saw in a carapace of iron. Then, dazzling light, always faced the traffic, he remembered with a frantic yell, and by some extraordinary luck, escaped miraculously onto the opposite pavement. There was no doubt about it. By the skin of his teeth he had dodged a rather ugly death. First, he felt for his presence, all were safe, and then instead of congratulating himself and taking breath, he hurried homewards on foot, which proved that his mind had lost control a bit, thinking only how disappointed the wife and children would have been if anything had happened. Another thing he realized, oddly enough, was that he was no longer really loved his wife, but had only great affection for her. What made him think of that? Heaven only knows, but he did think of it. He was an honest man without pretense. This came as a discovery somehow. He turned a moment and saw the crowd gathered about the entangled taxicabs, policemen's helmets gleaming in the lights of the shop windows, then hurried on again, his thoughts full of the joys his presence would give, of the scampering children, and of his wife, bless her silly heart, eyeing the mysterious parcels. And though he could never explain how, he presently stood at the door of the jail-like building that contained his flat, having walked the whole 3 miles. His thoughts had been so busy and absorbed that he had hardly noticed the length of weary trudge. Besides, he reflected, thinking of the narrow escape, I've had a nasty shock. It was a damn near thing, now I come to think of it. He still felt a bit shaky and bewildered. Yet, at the same time he felt extraordinarily jolly and light-hearted. He counted his Christmas parcels, hugged himself in anticipation and joy, and let himself in swiftly with his latchkey. I'm late, he realized, but when she sees the brown paper parcels, she'll forget to say a word. God bless the old faithful soul. And he softly used the key a second time and entered his flat on tiptoe. In his mind was the master impulse of that afternoon, the pleasure these Christmas presents would give his wife and children. He heard a noise. He hung up hat and coat in the poky vestibule, they never called it hall, and moved softly toward the parlor door, holding the packages behind him. Only of them, he thought. Not of himself, of his family, that is, not of the packages. Pushing the door cunningly ajar, he peeped in shyly. To his amazement, the room was full of people. He withdrew quickly, wondering what it meant. A party? And without his knowing about it? Extraordinary. Keen disappointment came over him, but as he stepped back, the vestibule he saw was full of people too. He was uncommonly surprised, yet somehow not surprised at all. People were congratulating him. There was a perfect mob of them. Moreover, he knew them all, vaguely remembered them at least, and they all knew him. Isn't it a game? Laughed someone, patting him on the back. They haven't the least idea. And the speaker was old John Palmer, the bookkeeper at the office, emphasized the they. Not the least idea, he answered with a smile, saying something he didn't understand, yet knew was right. His face apparently showed the utter bewilderment he felt. The shock of the collision had been greater than he realized evidently. His mind was wandering. Possibly. Only the odd thing was, he had never felt so clear-headed in his life. 10,000 things grew simple suddenly. But how thickly these people pressed about him, how familiarly. My parcels, he said, joyously pushing his way across the throng. These are Christmas presents I've bought for them. He nodded towards the room. I've saved for weeks. Stopped cigars and billiards and several other good things to buy them. Good man, said Palmer with a happy laugh. It's the heart that counts. Mudberry looked at him. Palmer had said an amazing truth only. People would hardly understand and believe him, would they? He asked, feeling stuffed and stupid, muddled somewhere between 2 meanings, one of which was gorgeous and the other stupid beyond belief. If you please, Mr. Mudberry, step inside. They are expecting you, said a kindly pompous voice, and turning sharply, he met the gentle, foolish eyes of Sir James Epiphany, a director of the bank where he worked. The effect of the voice was instantaneous from long habit. They are, he smiled from his heart, and advanced as from the custom of many years. Oh, how happy and gay he felt! His affection for his wife was real. Romance, indeed, had gone, but he needed her, and she needed him. And the children, Millie, Bill, and Jean, he deeply loved them. Life was worth living indeed. In the room was a crowd, but in astounding silence. John Mudberry looked around him. He advanced toward his wife, who sat in the corner armchair with Millie on her knee. A lot of people talked and moved about. Momentarily, the crowd increased. He stood in front of them, in front of Millie and his wife, and he spoke, holding out his packages. "It's Christmas Eve," he whispered shyly, "and I've brought you something. Something for everybody. Look!" He held the packages before their eyes. Of course," said a voice behind him. "But you may hold them out like that for a century. They'll never see them." "Of course they won't. But I love to do the old sweet thing," replied John Mudberry, then wondered with a gasp of stark amazement why he said it. "I think," whispered Millie, staring round her. "Well, what do you think?" her mother asked sharply. "You're always thinking something odd." "I think," the girl continued dreamily, "that Daddy's already here." She paused, then added with a child's impossible conviction, "I'm sure he is. I feel him." There was an extraordinary laugh. Sir James Epiphany laughed. The others, the whole crowd of them, also turned their heads and smiled. But the mother, thrusting the child away from her, rose up suddenly with a violent start. Her face had turned to chalk. She stretched her arms out into the air before her. She gasped and shivered. There was anguish in her eyes. "Look," repeated John. "These are the presents that I brought." But his voice apparently was soundless, and with a spasm of icy pain he remembered that Palmer and Sir James, some years ago, had died. "It's magic," he cried, "but I love you, Ginny. I love you, and I've always been true to you, as true as steel. We need each other. Oh, can't you see? We go on together, you and I, forever and ever." "Think," interrupted an exquisitely tender voice. "Don't shout. They can't hear you now." And turning, John Mudberry met the eyes of Everard Minturn, their president of the year before. Minturn had gone down with the Titanic. He dropped his parcels then. His heart gave an enormous leap of joy. He saw her face. The face of his wife looked through him. But the child gazed straight into his eyes. She saw him. The next thing he knew was that he heard some tinkling. Far, far away, it sounded miles below him. Inside him, he was sounding himself, all utterly bewildering, like a bell. It was a bell. Millie stopped down and picked up the parcels. Her face shone with happiness and laughter. But a man came in soon after, a man with a ridiculous, solemn face, a pencil and a notebook. He wore a dark blue helmet. Behind him came a string of other men. They carried something. Something. He could not see exactly what it was, but when he pressed forward through the laughing throng to gaze upon it, he dimly made out 2 eyes, a nose, a chin, a deep red smear, and a pair of folded hands upon an overcoat. A woman's form fell down upon them then, and he heard soft sounds of children weeping strangely, and other sounds, as of familiar voices laughing gaily. "They'll join us presently. It goes like a flash." And, turning with great happiness in his heart, he saw that Sir James had said it, holding Palmer by the arm, as with some natural yet unexpected love of sympathetic friendship. "Come on," said Palmer, smiling like a man who accepts a gift in universal fellowship. "Let's help 'em. They'll never understand. Still, we can always try." The entire throng moved up with laughter and amusement. It was a moment of hearty, genuine life at last. Delight and joy and peace were everywhere. Then John Mudberry realized the truth, that he was dead. A Curious Experience by Norah Lofts. I once had a curious experience, and those who dismiss it as a silly girl's fancy should think again. I was 23 at the time and had been married for 2 years. When Greg proposed to me in an offhand way, I said, "You know, or you should do, that I am not the domestic type. If you really want little wifey waiting with a casserole in the oven and your slippers warming by the well-swept hearth, you must look elsewhere." Greg said that if he had been interested in casseroles and well-warmed slippers, he'd have settled for Amanda. Between me and Amanda, I must confess, It had been as the Duke of Wellington said of Waterloo, a damn close run thing. But I had won, and for 2 years Greg and I lived a bit of that happily ever after stuff. Happy as larks, as they say, though we had no nest. The firm for which he worked was busy grooming him, a nice term for holding the carrot well out of his reach at one end and applying stick at the other. Young men with potential must be mobile, must gain experience at all levels, so Greg shuttled about, and I went with him, dragging my portable typewriter, my thick notebook, and a bag of reference books. I had already published one novel, highly praised, savagely criticized, not very profitable. And then Greg's firm decreed that to complete his grooming he must spend 3 months in New York. The wives of the fully groomed are recognized, and they may accompany their husbands, expenses paid. But those ungroomed are presumed to be single, footloose. I said, darling, we simply can't afford it. I'll find some place and tuck in and finish my book. 3 months will just about do it. I squinted at him. I do squint when I concentrate. I said, you go and fall in love with some American floozy, and I'll disown you. I didn't want him to feel that he must provide for me while we were separated. It had been all right when I tagged about after him. Leeds, Bradford, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Bristol, Norwich. Mostly we had lived in cheap hotels, cheap furnished flats. When we were somewhere where food was provided, we ate what was offered. Otherwise, I bought things like beef burgers, fish fingers. Very often, my only cooking facility was a frying pan on a gas ring. But I felt that in a way I earned my keep. For the next 3 months, he would not have even the benefit of my company, and living is expensive in America. So I began to look around for a job. A fairish knowledge of archaeology and ancient history is not the most readily marketable asset, and I was quite glad to find part-time employment in a public library in a Suffolk town called Bildon. There I was also lucky enough to find not a flat, but a furnished house at an astonishingly low rent, so low indeed that until I saw the place I had the darkest suspicions. The agent made an appointment for me to meet Mrs. Willis at the house, 18 Hillcrest Avenue, on the following afternoon. Hillcrest Avenue was a quiet cul-de-sac, within easy walk of the town center, at the top of what in Suffolk passes for a hill, a very slight rise. It consisted mainly of pairs of semi-detached houses, neither ancient nor modern, all very neat and spruce, with a small garden in front, a longer one behind. The house had a living room, a dining room, kitchen, two fair-sized bedrooms, and a tiny one, a bathroom. It was completely furnished, and a good solid stuff. Everything, Mrs. Willis said, pulling open a drawer in the kitchen, down to the last egg spoon. Then I asked myself, why so cheap? I lived in some tatty rooms that called themselves flatlets, and cost double. She answered my unspoken question. I didn't feel justified in asking much because there are so many snags from the tenant's point of view. Insecurity of tenure for one thing. I have to ask for a signed agreement that a week's, or at most a fortnight's notice will be accepted. You see, the house belongs to an old aunt of mine. She is very arthritic, quite incapable of looking after herself, and I'm much too far away, and too busy. Personally, I don't think she will ever leave the home where she is now, but she is convinced that she will one day find a housekeeper and be able to come back. It would be unkind to try to make her see sense. Then she began to fret about the house standing empty, so I offered to let it, and she quite took to the idea. It's a great nuisance for me. I have to see potential tenants and generally keep an eye on things. She glanced around. Doesn't look too bad, does it? And you needn't worry about the garden. A man comes half a day a week. I felt that this could not be a very profitable enterprise. How long has your aunt been in this home? I asked. Mrs. Willis did mental arithmetic. Almost 4 years, she said. Fortunately, she is comfortably off. I reckon that she spends at least £3 a week answering advertisements and closing stamped addressed envelopes, most of which never come back. But there it is. It's her hobby, the one thing that keeps her alive. What about the gas and electricity? I asked. Oh, well, there I did make a stand. It was such a nuisance, having the stuff cut off and put on again and people going off without paying their bills. So I had meters. They're under the sink. Well, I must be off. I hope you'll be happy here. And don't worry too much about the week's notice. The housekeeper my aunt is looking for went out with the crinoline. I moved in later that afternoon. Blessing my luck, I decided that the dining room at the back and adjoining kitchen should be my work and living room. One end of the good solid table holding my typewriter and my books, the other my simple haphazard meals. The house had, I now realized, that faintly musty smell that comes from disuse, and I opened all the windows. I noticed that despite its nearness to the main shopping center, this near suburb had a little shopping precinct of its own. I went down to investigate and found it perfect for my purpose. The general store had a deep freeze and a delicatessen counter. Next door was a laundrette, and beyond it an off-license and a sub-post office, both endearingly miniature. A chemist shop and a hairdresser's completed the semicircle. The housewives in this area were well catered for, and I was one of them. Lucky me. The rot set in when, the June evening glow waning, I got up and switched on the light. As I type, I tend to look up and stare straight ahead, and from the place where I had chosen, where I looked at was a sideboard of the kind called a chiffonier. Somebody, either the last tenant or perhaps Mrs. Willis, had given its flat surface a hasty swipe with a duster. The thing was made, I think, of rosewood, and a semicircular swipe had left a richly glowing area edged thickly with gray dust. A similar swipe had been made at the delicately framed mirror which formed its back. For some reason that I cannot explain, what remained dusty on the rosewood, smeared on the glass, bothered me. I simply could not concentrate. I got up, went into the kitchen, found a rather dirty duster, and did a bit of cleaning up. At the same time, I took my coffee cup and the plate from which I had eaten my 2 sausage rolls into the kitchen. Then I sat down, typed a few lines, and knew that the good spirit had gone from me. Who said that cogent thing, that complaints of all writers? What can I do for Posey now that the good spirit has gone from me? What can I do but useless sit and overread what I have writ? Deadly. The thing we all fear. So, check. I wasted an hour in a futile chase and then gave up and went to bed. In the morning, I woke up quite early and got out of bed with a thought new to me. I don't want to come back to an unmade bed and a littered kitchen. Up to that morning, although I had never enjoyed absolute squalor, I had been a bit slap-happy about time, so long as a bed was made before it was occupied, a cup washed before it was used again. I had been content to shuffle along. What had got into me? I left a neatly made bed, a tidy kitchen behind me, when I went to the library. It was Sunday, a busy day, my longest day, 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. At about 12:30, there was a little lull, and I had time to say to the head librarian, a pleasant, very academic-looking woman, "Miss Forbes, who wrote that verse beginning, 'What can I do for Posey?' It haunts me, and I can't trace it." She said, "I never heard it. Posey sounds a bit archaic. Could it be Chaucer?" No, not that it mattered, just an idle thought. On the way home, I bought enough of what is called convenience food to sustain me through the weekend. I put in a good session of work. The musty smell inside the house still bothered me, and I again opened the windows, this time noticing that they were very dirty. Something impelled me to clean them. When I told Greg that I was not the domestic type, I was being, as always, flatly truthful. I was born and lived until I was 8 in Jamaica, where hired help was plentiful. I was then sent to school in London, and there we made our beds and took turns with the washing up. After that, college, digs, marriage, and a nomad life. The only ordinary household of which I had ever been a part was that of my grandmother in school holidays, and she not only wanted no help from me, she had the obsessive idea that unless I was studying, I was wasting my time, and my parents' hard-earned money. I had never in my life cleaned a window. From a sour-smelling cupboard under the sink, I chose the least filthy of a number of clothes, washed it and armed with it and a duster and a bucket of water, set to starting on the dining room table. I was awkward and slow. As a matter of fact, physical activities have never been my thing. Hopeless at gym, a mockery on the hockey field. I'm not built for it, too. Too tall, too loosely put together. It took me most of the morning to clean that one window, largely because smears would shift. When I was inside, they were out, and vice versa. I wasted a lot of time making exit and entrances through the kitchen. But in my way, I'm thorough, and shortly before lunchtime, that window looked a lot better. So much so indeed that I made resolve to clean all the others, in due course, one a day perhaps. Instant coffee and some fish fingers restored me, and I sat down to type. But the smell of that kitchen cupboard haunted me. I simply could not concentrate. Work done in such circumstances is never good, so I gave in and went to empty and cleanse that offensive retreat. It was a disgusting job, but I was rewarded by finding in the cupboard's furthest corner a container of something called Clear Shine, on which the label promised that it took the labor out of window cleaning. Simply spray on and rub. I put this treasure carefully on one side and carried the rest out to the dustbin, which was crammed to the brim, largely, it seemed to me, with cartons and packages of discarded foodstuffs, a half-empty pack of biscuits, an unopened pack containing 4 currant buns, hard as wood, some moldy green cheese, some evil-smelling fish still in the can. I braced myself and remembered that fire purges. June is not a month when birds suffer much privation, but I gave them the biscuits and the buns, hoping that some woodpecker might come along to deal with the latter. Then I made a bonfire at the furthest end of the back garden. As I returned to the house, the sun shone on the clean window and twinkled at me encouragingly. I needed encouragement. I was bone weary, far too tired now to face the typewriter. When Mrs. Willis showed me around, I had noticed that the sitting room contained a television set. I'd relax, I thought, as so many thousands do, feet up in front of the box. But relax I could not. The sofa and the armchairs in this room were covered in a pretty floral chintz, which on closer acquaintance didn't feel or look or even smell right. All through a moderately entertaining program, half my mind was busy with the thought of that laundrette at the foot of the hill, and with the thought that tomorrow was Monday, my free day. Few people change books on Mondays. Either they have not completed the reading or they are busy with other things, such as washing at home or visiting laundrettes. The thing snowballed. I found out, for instance, that every tenant the house had ever had used the same few articles of bed linen, those at the front. Further back there were blankets with which the moths had made merry, and linen that acquired black stripes simply by being in the cupboard for so long unused. The laundrette saw a lot of me that week. On my free days, Monday and Tuesday, I did a do-it-yourself job. On the other days I left my bundle on my way to the library. The woman in charge took care of it, and I collected it on the way home. Another ridiculous thing happened, too. In the general store I saw some fresh garden peas. I could just remember how they tasted, cooked with a sprig of mint. I thought, how silly to buy frozen peas when fresh ones are in season. I never studied psychology, but I had read enough to know what was wrong with me. Fundamentally, I thought, I did not like or was not satisfied with a story on which I should be working. Second novels are notoriously tricky. Anyone can write a first novel. I'd lost my nerve. Never glad, confident morning again. When I'd chosen a bad subject or made a wrong approach, or God help me, I was one of the novel gang. And now I was taking a refuge from my predicament by pretending to be busy with other things. Not a pleasant thought. In fact, a thought to flee from. Scrub the kitchen floor, scrub the larder shelves. That activity brought me a bonus. My right wrist gave way and I had to wear a wide leather strap, a kind of miniature buskin, on it for a fortnight. Perhaps professional typists or those profoundly inspired can type with one hand. I could not. I could only do little jobs such as separating meat knives from tablespoons in the baize-lined compartments of the kitchen drawer, and bringing order to the things which hung on hooks on the dresser, and throwing out 7, why 7, stinking old sweaty socks that somebody had secreted in the cupboard under the stairs. During this period, a sweet girl at the library typed 4 letters to Greg for me, and I made shift to sign them, hoping that he would not think that I had taken to drink or drugs. Her spelling was highly individual. By the time I could discard the strap, I knew what was wrong with my book. It was the approach. It was a first-person story, and I had been writing in the third. The good spirit had not abandoned me. It came back now, very powerful. The character I can only relate what he or she sees with his own eyes, ears, so I needed more than one narrator. And by heaven I had them. Quite suddenly, three of them. Three people saying I, with their separate, differing stories, making a whole. Wonderful. The kind of thing that makes up for the self-distrust, the loneliness, the frustrations. I couldn't wait to get started. I practically ran home, pausing only to buy a slice of veal and ham pie, some eggs, a loaf, and a bit of cheese. This was Wednesday, a clear, free day tomorrow. Tomorrow, in my immaculate, sweet-smelling house, I should sit down, make a fresh start, prove myself to not be one of the one-book brigade. But even as I put my purchases down on the kitchen table, the gas cooker cried out, "What about me? Me first!" I cleaned it once. Like the rest of the house, under a kind of superficial cleanliness, it had been filthy. It was now not filthy, but a little soiled. Pulling off a saucepan left-handedly, I had spilt some milk. "All right," I said to it. "But that is the last thing in the cleaning line that I shall do here." Using my right hand, a little occasionally, I cleaned it. Then I went into the dining room, sat down, made the usual sandwich, top paper, carbon copy paper. With steady, comforting fingers, I typed Part 1, Chapter 1. Oh, joy. And then the bell rang. I cursed as I went to the door. Somebody collecting, somebody wanting to know if I had put my name on the electoral roll, somebody wanting to know if Mr. A, Mrs. B, Miss C still lived here, and if not, what was there any forwarding address? "Hell," I said at last. "Blast! I'll tell whoever it is where to look for a subscription, a vote, a bygone tenant." Squinting, I opened the door, and there was Mrs. Willis. She said, "Good evening, Mrs. Fraser. I'm sorry to disturb you so late." In fact, it was not late. Possibly my squinting scowl made her think that she was not exactly welcome. I said, "Come in." She said, "Well, just for a minute. I'm in a bit of a hurry, but I was fairly near, and I thought I should come and explain. Personally. A completely unforeseen thing has happened. My aunt has found a housekeeper." What did she expect me to do? Fall flat on my face? Set myself on fire? I said, "How nice for her. When do I move?" We were in the sitting room with sparkling window, fresh curtains, crisp, clean chintz. I could see her taking it all in. "Well," she said hesitantly, "I told her a fortnight. I thought you must have a week's notice, and that it would take me at least a week too. But you seem to have done it. The place even smells differently. I'm so sorry. It does seem a shame." A thought struck me. I said, "Would you call your aunt a dominant personality, Mrs. Willis?" She gave that a second's consideration. "Yes, I would. I mean, the way she has stuck to this idea about coming home. Most women of her age." "And is she house proud?" "Oh, very much so. Terribly particular. She'd empty an ashtray as soon as you ground out the stuff. You know?" "I know," I said, meaning that I knew what had got into me. I'd been for a month possessed. Mrs. Willis said, "I do hope you don't mind too much. I did want—" "I don't mind a bit," I said truthfully. I thought, tomorrow the world. A cheap hotel, a babysitter, anonymous and undemanding, a chalet in a holiday camp, a caravan, a tent in the middle of a field. Mrs. Willis touched a chintz cover. She said, "You must have gone to considerable expense. I think it would be only fair to return, shall we say, a week's rent." I thought of the wrong storyline, with which, in any other surroundings, I might have bashed on. The bad second novel that can ruin one's career, and of the good, sound, wonderful one that was waiting. I said, "That is very kind, Mrs. Willis, but in fact, I owe the house more than it owes me. Living here has been quite an experience."